Hey everybody, my name is Jeff Norton and I'm based in the UK, and normally this time of year we'd all be together at Sheffield, and it's one of my favorite markets and favorite festivals, but alas we're together virtually via Zoom and other online platforms. I'm the founder of Dominion of Drama and I focus on scripted. I've written a number of children's books over the years, I think possibly 12 now, and I've had the good fortune to meet many of you in the traffic of our incredible business. And today we're going to have a focus on Canada. I'm actually from Canada originally, but I live in UK, so my family life is literally a co-production. But today we're going to talk to two fantastic producers out of Canada. They're actually both based in Toronto, about the scene on the ground there, what's going on with local commissions, what's going on in terms of co-productions. And I think it'll be informative and helpful for everybody to understand not only the Canadian marketplace, but how to collaborate and co-produce with Canada. So let's get started.
I'm Ken Fair, El Presidente and CEO of Epic Story Media, which I started just over 3 years ago to create, work with creators to produce, develop, distribute, manage brands for the global market. I've been in the kids business for about 20 some odd years, and this is my next iteration and my last iteration. I'm going to do this for the remainder of my life.
So today the focus is on Canada, and I'm incredibly pleased to have Lisa Olfman from Portfolio Entertainment. Lisa, could you give everybody, I suppose at home, not in the audience at home, a little flavor for who you are, what you do, how you do it, Portfolio? Give us a sense of what's what.
Absolutely. So Portfolio Entertainment. I am one half of a duo. My partner is Joy Rosen.
Dynamic duo?
The dynamic duo. Thank you. I appreciate that. We founded Portfolio 30 years ago. So in fact, this month we are celebrating our 30th anniversary. We started the company to produce and distribute kids and family content. However, I would say in the last couple of years, we've also expanded and diversified into primetime and adult animation as well. So we have three pillars to our business. We develop and produce both live action and animation content. We have a 2D animation studio, and we also have a global distribution company.
Fantastic. And how you, not in a percentage wise, but I'm interested in the sort of split of the work that you're doing that's focused on a commission out of Canada versus the US or co-production abroad. You know, how do you sort of, as you mentioned, you're very global in your outlook. Obviously you're based in Canada, but you really can't survive in this business these days unless you're global. I'm just curious how you think about, you know, your anchor tenant, I guess, in terms of the broadcaster or the platform you want to start with.
Okay, well, first of all, Canada is a great place to produce content. We have Shaw Rocket Fund, we have Rogers Telefund, and we have a few very dedicated platforms in Canada, including TV Ontario and Knowledge Network. So, you know, the biggest factor for us now having to change our strategy in who we go to is really, you know, as you probably know, the decline of, you know, the commissions that we've had in Canada is due to the CRTC, which is our regulatory body, providing broadcasters with greater flexibility around how and they produce Canadian content, which has created a tremendous decline in the commissions for kids and family.
There was a stat, in fact, I've got this, I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a report called Profile from Canada Media Producers Association, CMPA, which basically said that not only did the total domestic television production, this is pre-pandemic, fell by almost 13%, but it seems that kids was a big part of that drop, about 30% of that.
Right.
And so that's what you've been experiencing in terms of the regulatory changes having a knock-on effect into actual commissions.
Yeah, so I mean, it was devastating for most companies that produce content in Canada for kids and family entertainment. However, you know, having a global distribution company and having you know, deep relationships with broadcasters and platforms outside of Canada really was a tremendous anchor for us. We produce a lot of content with PBS, who is one of the, you know, the most wonderful broadcasters to work with. And I say this because They have such a strong commitment to and a vision for, or not a vision, mission for what they want to produce and what they do produce. And we've been fortunate to be partners of theirs since 2010. So they're an amazing broadcaster. When we initially started producing Cat in the Hat, we were producing it for PBS, and we did bring it into Canada. So we're used to that role of looking outside of Canada first. However, yeah, I mean, we were also benefactors of, in the heyday when there were stricter regulations around, broadcast requirements to produce Canadian content in the kids space. So it's not a surprise about, how were we going to, rethink our business model. We've always looked globally. It was a choice about how we could, finance shows. And when I say it's a choice, it's that we wanted to produce shows that were not just for the Canadian market. We're a small market, and we've had success with that. Now we are always looking outside of Canada first, and then bringing shows back into Canada.
Well, I think it's the domestic market we're talking about here, and Canada's always had a really strong system to support independent production. And a few things have changed over the last few years. I mean, certainly the linear business, the traditional television business has certainly been impacted all over the world. COVID had some positive impacts in terms of increased viewership, but the business itself has been migrating more to the streaming services. So that's one factor. The other factor is certain technical changes that happened in the system here, which allowed some of the larger consolidated broadcasters to have a little bit more flexibility on their Canadian content spend. So it's allowed them to not put as much into kids per se. They could put that spend, the Canadian content spend, into the other parts of their business. So if they have, targeting female viewership or male viewership, adult viewership, sports, whatever it might be. So the amount to spend towards kids wasn't necessarily, maybe even thought of, but it certainly wasn't protected when some of these changes happened, where they reduced the amount of Canadian content. Some networks had a higher Canadian content requirement, some had lower, depending on when they got licensed, but they flattened it out, allowed flexibility. So that was a big part of it. And the two major commercial broadcasters here in Canada, in WildBrain and Corus, they do have, WildBrain is only a kids player, so they've pretty much maintained their amount to spend for independent content, but it was never the biggest percentage. Really, Corus has so many kids channels, including YTV, et cetera, and that also they have acquired, or they acquired Shaw Media's assets, broadcast assets. So there was a lot there that were some of the moving parts that in some ways reduced the amount that they were spending, certainly with independent productions, and they also have their own animation studio. So I totally understand these things, and I get it. They are in the business after all, and they're looking to deliver for their shareholders. So they're meeting their requirements, but they have a little more flexibility. And then the other networks, the public networks, whether it be CBC, TVO, they've continued on, but they were not ordering as much as, certainly they're not increasing the amount they're spending. CBC might have. And they've been consistent. So I think the biggest piece comes down to that, and also that the linear spend is tied to revenues, which certainly were impacted in COVID. I think the numbers that you gave were for 2020. So if it's the entire year, I actually haven't seen those stats, but it certainly makes sense to me. I would have thought it was somewhere in that range, because there's certainly less independently driven Canadian content shows compared to years past.
And Ken, just for the folks who are outside of Canada, can you just help people understand that regulatory framework? Like what, you mentioned required spend. How does that work? Who sets that? Because I think a lot of people probably aren't familiar with the
Sure.
framework and with the system in Canada.
Yeah, not to go into too many technical details, and I'm not a policy expert, but ultimately it's a combination of the CRTC, which it licenses our broadcasters, as well as CAVCO, which certifies Canadian production. So I believe it was a CRTC change that happened about, 4 years ago. And certainly the CMPA, the Producers Association, was pushing against those changes. But it's a process, and people are able to submit, including people, regular consumers and viewers and audiences, and then ultimately the CRTC makes these policy changes, and it takes some time for the full impact to come in. So they're complicated things. One small tweak can have a pretty significant impact, and that's what we saw happening. In addition to just generally the business of traditional TV softening, as it is everywhere else in the world.
You mentioned a moment ago the lower commissions, the lower number of commissions in Canada. I'm curious if you had a sort of, that I'm not saying you're the head of the CRTC, but if you had a kind of magic wand to wave, what are the changes that you would advocate in the domestic market to try and shore up the business in Canada?
Well, the CMPA, the Producers Association, has been, ahead of me on all of those fronts in terms of, lobbying. But certainly we need to put in place more requirements around the SVODs that are, in the Canadian marketplace in terms of Canadian content. We're a small country.
They have no quota, right? It's not like Europe where there's a quota. There's no, just for people may not be aware that they're in the marketplace, but there's no requirement for marriage of local content or anything like that, is there?
Well, there is some requirement, but it is such a low bar. But it's not just, the SVODs, it's the broadcasters who feel that, as the market has changed, and they are not the only platforms that, as SVODs have come in there, it's really cannibalized their market share. I think that the CRTC, if they want a Canadian voice, then they need to help us by putting in some more requirements that would bring up the amount of Canadian commissions as lead broadcasters. Because it's rare. We've been very fortunate. We have been fortunate. We've had the support of Shaw. We've had the support of Rogers Telefund. Shaw Rocket Fund, I should say, and we've had some good commissions from Chorus Entertainment, but it's far and few between.
Well, the CMPA does an amazing job representing producers. I do have to say a shout out to them in many different ways. That not just on the policy issues, but also during COVID, they've done a lot of things working with government. So they're probably better to comment on what they've done more studies than I would have. But on the surface of it, if the Canadian networks had a higher Canadian content requirement from indies, that would certainly trigger more productions. It's also related to the Cable Media Fund, or the Content Media Fund, Canadian Media Fund actually, and how the envelopes are triggered, because it's all driven by the broadcaster. So because the broadcasters aren't triggering as many CMF finance shows, less of it's being used for kids content. So if there was potentially a little bit more involvement that established producers and up and coming emerging producers could trigger it, not necessarily tied to Canadian broadcast licensees, that could help. I wouldn't change all of it for that. Again, on the surface, every one shift that you make has an impact on other things. So it's hard to just have one blanket statement. And then, of course, the foreign services, which are not regulated right now. So there's a lot of work being done right now by the government here in Canada to impose a certain percentage of spend back into the Canadian system. So whether that be Netflix or any coming services, Disney Plus, et cetera. So right now there is no domestic requirement. So I think they're charging HST now, or the VAT, similar to VAT. So they weren't even collecting that taxes from Canadians who are purchasing the service. So that's one thing. And then there's a move to have a certain percentage of their revenues to be put back into the system for Canadian content shows. So those things would have a huge impact, because right now there's a ton of service work in Canada, which is great for studios and those who are producing on behalf of the large studios, but it doesn't allow producers to own and retain IP, which ultimately has more value to the company if they can have a successful franchise.
if you've got, I don't want to say fewer doors to knock on, or there's fewer dollars to pull down out of the tree, I suppose, how are you thinking about navigating your business? And are you looking outside of Canada? Are you looking at co-productions? Finance plans are always difficult to pull off, but how are you navigating the kind of new normal?
Yeah, I mean, I've always looked at it that way, even in the days where you could potentially generate 70% of your financing for a show, 80% out of Canada. Sometimes some people were able to generate 100, rare. We've always had to think about the international market. Canada has more treaties with international, with countries around the world, I think, than anybody else. So it's always been in the DNA. We're a smaller country. After all, we're only 37 million or so population, sitting next to the US, which is 375. And the airwaves spill over. We get free-to-air broadcasts from the US. So we've always had that issue of being a very small territory that has punched above its weight, and all of the regulatory issues, the tax credits that we still have. There's still a lot of financing available in Canada, so it gives us a base. We have the tax credits are probably the foundational piece of that. It's tied to the labor spend in Canada, and that has helped to grow the industry over the years, in addition to the amount of service production that comes. So talent is here. Tax credits are here. There are opportunities with Canadian broadcasters. We have the Canadian Media Fund that has tried to find ways to create opportunities for producers. And we've been able to secure some of that funding for some short form content properties that we created. Certainly during COVID, we were able to secure some funding for that. So we definitely look at the Canadian market and see what can we do here. But ultimately, we're always looking at whether it's the creators, whether it's certainly the US market, obviously with the major players there and a lot of the consolidation and the new SVOD. So we're always looking at what's going to work in the US and in the global market. We also look at China. We've got 2 productions we're doing there with 2 different partners that we've been in production on over the last year. Can't talk about the properties, but I've spent a lot of time visiting China and working with partners there. And then Europe, obviously, we have co-production treaties with pretty much every European territory, as far as I know. So we're always in discussions with producers from different territories where they might have a favorable relationship with networks, or would allow us to produce shows that under co-productions where we could qualify the shows as European content, which is still very important. Australia as well, and other emerging territories. We're always looking at, combination of talent, financing, cultural fit in the content that we have, and partners who could help us scale the property without us having to necessarily scale our company to be able to handle the entire world. We're very focused on making sure we can manage North America, and with partners who might be in the UK or in France who can really help build a brand there. So we're not just trying to get a show on air, we're trying to build a brand. And that requires a lot more resources and effort and people in order to do that. And we can't cover it all from here, but certainly North America is where our focus is. But then we partner with others elsewhere to help us manage the brand.
One of the things about Canadian producers that have been working in the industry for, not necessarily as long as us, but for a while, is that we have always had to work collaboratively. We're a small market. So we need to know how to not just utilize all of the treaties and opportunities to work with other countries, but also how to find talent, not just in Canada, but outside of Canada, and find ways to creatively collaborate and financially collaborate. Having a sales team means that we have access to relationships all around the world. And that's been, the anchor that we've used to be able to bring content to other platforms, but it also has given us an opportunity to get to know other creators outside of Canada and work with them to build shows that work globally.
Could you give us any, without naming names or shows that aren't announced, but any concrete examples of the way you've structured a co-pro or two? And I'm interested particularly, are you the majority and your partner might be in a minority position? Is it 50-50? How are you structuring these things? As I understand it, the minimum threshold is 20% for most of the Canadian treaties. But how are you thinking about the structure on some of the things you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the business side of it in terms of, let's say, back end or ultimately the back end. We try and find a landing spot that is a fair business deal first, and then look at how you follow kind of the treaty requirements. That's super important, both from a creative, grid point of view. And so, again, we have really good spreadsheets that we do the work splits on to make sure that we're hitting all the points in the spend. But I think most importantly is like, what's a fair business deal between two partners? So the treaty says one thing, but ultimately it should be reflective in the efforts, financing that's being brought to the table, and risk that companies are taking.
Well, what would you say to the kind of global animation community in terms of working either with you or with Canada in general, in terms of how people should think about, having a focus on Canada and seeking to work with either in an official treaty co-production capacity or even just creative collaboration?
Well, I think it's the last part. I think that the reason that we should look at anyone is because of the creative content and what our unique offering is. That's where it starts. And if we can do that well with a partner and it's additive creatively, then the financing models will follow from that. So that's really the basis on how we look at any of our co-productions. We start there. What is where's the content coming from? What is it that we saw, and how will it be magnified or amplified by having a particular co-production partner?
The UK is filled with such incredible talent. That to me is always the number one on the list. Talent, experience, cultural sensibility. I think the Brits and Canadians have a real similar sensibility when it comes to comedy. We have a lot of British content on air here in Canada with the British voices, and I've been to the UK so many times, so many friends there. So Britain, the UK has always been super important for me. Obviously the BBC's there, which I've worked with quite a few times over the years, and we're working with them right now on a property that we're hopefully going into co-production on. But we also look at Ireland, which has great talent, and also financial benefits. The tax credit in the UK has certainly helped. And then, there's other funds that are there. So there's a good momentum on the financing side, which wasn't there previously, actually. And if the properties that are co-produced can still qualify as European content for the mainland, so to speak, that's super helpful. So, I think the UK has had an incredible run also in the primetime side. The last year and a half, and certainly during COVID, I've watched tons of British crime shows, like plethora of it. And I subscribe to BritBox, by the way. So no, I think it's always top of the list for me in terms of partners that we can have, co-producers and certainly broadcasters. But Ireland as well, Northern Ireland, and then Ireland also, and other European countries. So I'm not an expert of Brexit and what the impact of it, but from what I'm hearing, it sounds like it should be fine in terms of EU quota. But there's always every quota, every policy has little nooks and crannies, and we have an incredibly strong head of business affairs who's very good at understanding the treaties and the different iterations of financing. It is its own level of complexity, and creativity in financing is I wouldn't say as important as the creative of the show, but you have to have it, and you have to have your A game on that side too. And I've always known that and played at those, tried to make sure that I'm as up to speed as I can and bring people in to help us understand it as much as we can. And you play by the rules, and you max out what you can on the financing side, and a great project, ultimately, they find their way to get greenlit.
How are you thinking about the UK as a gateway to Europe or not, just as everything's changed post-Brexit?
Right. Well, everything has changed since Brexit in terms of the financial component of it, and also how, the marketplace outside of Europe looks at the UK content. The UK producers and creators are still some of the most dynamic producers in the world. So we look at how can we work with some of the creators in the UK and create a global, again, a global sales opportunity. So whether it is through a treaty or whether it is through a distribution advance, we try to find our way based on falling in love with another creator or producer out of the UK.
There's more positivity out there. I mean, the last year was tough for everybody, no matter what. It was tough. I'm feeling like, things have settled a little bit more into a lean forward and we have to move forward kind of attitude. And, you have to have patience in this business because it's not easier, but it's more positive, I think, across the board in terms of networks acquiring things, but also the retail landscape in the US has had a very good year from a kids and toys perspective. So those are very good pieces of momentum that I'm hoping take us all forward into 21, 22.
That's all the time we have today for Focus on Canada. We will sing the national anthem, however, right now. No, I'm just kidding. So I just want to say a big thank you to my two panelists, Ken and Lisa. Thank you very much for sharing your time and expertise with everybody. And also to the CMC and everybody involved in pulling this off, including Lana behind the scenes. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe and let's keep animating.